Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the General Eclectic podcast with Rod Dreher. I'm your host, as always, Kale Zeldin, and we are here for episode number 29. Rod, great to see you. How you doing, brother?
I'm your guest, as always, Rod Dreher. I'm doing fine, man, but can I tell you, it's so hot here in Budapest right now. It's the hottest week of the summer, and this is where we're from, Louisiana. People would barely notice, but
Right.
I'm noticing because guess what, brother? No
AC.
air conditioning
No,
in
that's
my
what,
apartment.
it's so funny. So up here in New England, right? And certainly when I first got here about 15 years ago, AC was sort of considered a very un-Yankee soft thing to do. A lot of the old school Yankees, even now with temperatures sort of creeping up over the last decade, they're still sort of holdouts and we don't need AC. We're New Englanders, right? And so invariably, I go into the office, which is not AC'd. I go into the dining hall, which is not AC'd. And they're like, oh, Kale, in a really hot, humid day, like, oh, Kale, like, this is just like home. This must be nothing to you. And I'm like, no, it's terrible because at least at home, we have wall-to-wall AC everywhere. And up here, nothing. It's just, it's terrible, honestly.
Okay, can I just tell you this too before we actually talk about serious things? Although,
this
honestly,
is serious, dude.
Nothing is more serious to me this week than this. So I've noticed that when I go into restaurants here, I would try to just have soft drinks or water without ice the way they do. But as it's gotten hot, I'm just like, you know what? I'm going to let my freak flag fly. And you go and you ask them I said, I'd like I like a Coke Zero or sparkling water with ice. And they'll bring it to you without ice. It's like they just, like you just asked it, and I'd like a bone stuck through my nose.
Yeah, right.
But, you ask for it again, and they look at you like you're crazy. I'm like, just bring me some ice.
Yeah.
Or you can bring me a drink with ice in it.
Yeah.
What they'll eventually do is bring out a cocktail glass full of ice cubes with a spoon in it and hand it to you and look at you.
I don't know what to do with this thing. It's like,
no,
here,
seriously,
you freak from outer space,
and they look at you like, sir, am I doing this right? And I thank them for it. And then because it's so hot, I'll just guzzle it all down.
Of course.
It's like, hey, can I have another? And this time with ice.
With ice.
And they don't bring it with ice again. I say, no, with ice. And they'll bring me the whole thing of ice again. And usually whatever Hungarian is sitting at your table with you is laughing at you because you've outed yourself as the most obnoxious American. But you know what? I don't care.
I'm going to ride that bus. I'm going to ride that one because
I don't care.
One of my obscure all-time favorite movies from the 80s. It's totally obscure. It stars Harrison Ford and River Phoenix and I'm going to remember her name. She's a British actress, Helen Mirren. And it's called The Mosquito Coast. And he's this crazy inventor guy who decides, you know what? I'm done with sort of American consumerism. I'm going to go where I'm needed. And he goes down to South America, Latin America, and he brings ice, like refrigeration, to a tribe down there. And it's just, anyway, it's kind of a crazy movie, but it's always really stuck with me. But I remember him saying ice, this is civilization. This will matter to these people who live in this tropical, space. And I always think about that because, what would I do without refrigeration? I mean, seriously,
I can tell you what you do without it. I'm living it.
You sweat. Yeah, no, I know. So I hear you.
I just had lunch with an archaeologist actually here, and he also does a lot of work on migration trends.
Yep.
And he was telling me that he has just published an article in a journal talking about how, according to United Nations projections, the Middle East is going to lose between 60 and 80% of its fresh water in the coming decades. He said this is going to be a migration catastrophe.
Yeah.
And he said, where can these people go? India, don't think that India is going to let them in. China, forget it. Russia, not going to happen. And he said they can either go to Africa or to Europe. He said, well, 33% of Africans, according to a recent poll, want to come to Europe. So
wow.
The collapse, the huge population in the Middle East, the collapse of the fresh water there is going to create this massive humanitarian disaster and migration crisis in Europe. And they don't know how they're going to handle it here because, Chinese and Russians are badasses and they're not
don't
going to
care. They literally don't care. They're like, yeah, whatever, man. Yeah, have fun on the other side. No, it's a striking look. I think that's always been the most compelling aspect of climate change for me. I know that the planet, of course, can absorb all kinds of climate change itself, right? I mean, what I always used to chuckle about that is that, it's not the planet that's going to die. It's we're the ones who are going to die, not the planet will go on in some way, shape, or form. But life, biological reality will alter and definitely. But anyway, the idea that some portions that are currently habitable along the equator, let's say, will become simply uninhabitable. And then what happens with that? Well, we know what happens with that. Migrations happen. And of course, when migrations happen, people bring their strange gods with them. And so I don't see a way around a deep and metaphysical conflict on the horizon due to this kind of change, due to this kind of migration. It's going to be, I think the word that economists would use would be disruptive. I think it'll be disruptive.
And I tell you, to live here in Europe now and with so much civilizational self-confidence, flat on its back, no religion. I mean, Hungary is an outlier there. It's not an outlier on religion, sad to say, but it at least it is very confident about its own culture and willing to defend it. But this is a nation of like 9 million people. Its population rapidly shrinking. They can't go it alone. So, I mean, you and I, over the course of our lifetime, and certainly our kids' lifetimes, are going to see truly existential crises hitting Europe. I mean, it's something that we've always kind of known about and had in the back of our mind. But talking to the scientists today about the things that are coming and how that all of this stuff is going to get funneled towards Europe, and Europeans, either they may lack the will or the means to keep the people out. So I'm thinking that we're probably, if I had to lay money on it, I would say we're looking at something like a 21st century version of the barbarian invasions in the Roman Empire as it weakened.
Interesting.
There'll still be people living in Europe, but what kind of people will they be? I don't know.
Well, I wonder, you and I have not actually talked about this live, or I don't even know if you and I have ever talked about this just offline, you and I just chatting back and forth. What do you make of a civilization or civilizations that don't reproduce themselves? In other words, what does it mean when you don't want to have children?
I mean, it's,
you know what I mean by that? Like there's just some like obvious answer to that, but there's like a sort of a deeper existential metaphysical question to that, isn't there?
It's a death wish. But here's something that I find a twist on that question that I find even harder to understand. In this last week, I went to lunch with a couple of different people, young women, Hungarian women, and both of them are talking about how they want to be married one day and they want to start families. Children, but both of them, though, said that they really are scared to have children in this world. Now, here's something interesting about that. You hear this a lot from Americans, too, of that generation.
Yeah.
Their grandparents had children in the middle of World War II.
Right.
Right? And under communism, their parents had children under communism, and so on and so forth. What is happening that even though we live in a civilization that is more free than any that has ever been, that is wealthy,
more wealthy. I mean, we've got money coming out of our, collectively at least.
I mean,
not personally.
So what's going on there? I think that my tentative answer is, well, they're not wrong to see a lot of deep instability, like the whole question of transgenderism and. That frightens people, and the fact that society is speeding up so fast. Believe it or not, Kale, I've heard from people over here, younger people, who talk about how their parents and grandparents, a lot of them are miss communism, because things were stable. And
Wow.
they were miserable in most
Right.
ways, but they were stable. And there's this anxiety from the rapidity of cultural change, of liquid modernity, is undermining people. And I have to think that's probably some of it.
Yeah, I'm, you know, so much of what is driving in my mind, you know, the huge uptick in children identifying as trans or queer, you know, the extra, right, the surplus, you know, if you hold to the idea that there was a roughly 3 to 4% of the population stable, you know, that was sort of a stable figure for as long as we've been doing surveys about sexuality. How to account for the uptick, you know, getting up to 16, 17, 18% of a generation identifying as other, right?
It's queer, broadly
queer,
speaking.
right? As broadly understood as queer. I can't help but think that that is in some way a reaction against or a horror at the idea of reproduction. And I don't mean the horror from like, ooh, it's gross, like to have kids, but like to really not see a good in you know, the replication of the species, right? I remember even as a kid being struck when somebody would say, oh, well, I don't want to have kids. I mean, like, I just remember being like, well, I remember just sort of thinking, well, that's just what you do.
Yeah,
you know,
that's just it though. That's just what you do. It was that way about marriage and childbirth until like the day before yesterday. And I think when people are given a choice, they don't know what to choose. And there's this whole fear of missing out. You know, that's classic. And
of course, and I get that. I do understand that. You know, I mean, those messages are blasted so loud, so sexy, so colorful, so exciting, so adventurous. I get the way that works on you. I guess the sadder one for me, though, Rod, is that they simply elect not to. Like it's God, you know, it's like in other words, elect not to have children, not to marry, you know, find a mate, get married, have children, right? To keep the show going, if you will. It's a remarkable thing for a culture or cultures to commit suicide by infertility. Like elected infertility. Like it's really a remarkable thing. And I know that some people talk about this a bit, but I don't think we talk about it enough. I mean, it's almost one of those things like it's such a dark space in my psyche that I can't quite face it, that people would look at life and look, you know, you and I both understand suffering. We've lived through things, we go through things. Like I'm not a grass is always greener. I'm not a Ted Lasso in my power of positive thinking, although I adore Ted Lasso. And I finally took you up on that suggestion.
We all do.
It's amazing. But, you know, but it's remarkable to me that that projected sense that life is so terrible and that life will be so terrible that you would not elect to pass yourself. I mean, it's really, I know I'm struggling to articulate what I mean here, but it's deeply, deeply sad.
Well, and the fact that, you know, as we were saying earlier, the fact that generations who had to deal with extreme poverty and uncertainty still managed to do it, whereas we, who have achieved the most middle class existence of all, are just dying from lack of will to live, a will to to survive. And
yeah, the word that Eliot uses in one of his poems is velleity. You know, the lowest impulse to life. Like it's like I can barely even like burp it out. I can just barely even like it's almost, dare I say, meaningless, right? I mean, this is the kind of, you know, this sort of practical nihilism that I think we are struggling with as a people, and this is cross-culturally, clearly.
Yeah, well, yeah, and this, we should say that it's not just in the West that the fertility rate has collapsed; it's collapsing globally, except in Africa.
Yeah.
So
well, I first became aware of this. Sorry to interrupt, but I first became aware of this sort of demographic reality back in the 90s when I was reading a piece about Japan. and that at the time, I think Japan was going to be the first country, I think sometime in 2030, that would no longer that population's levels would actually start decreasing, right?
Yeah.
Like raw number decrease, which is almost impossible to do. I mean, it can only be done electively, right? That Japan had just decided it was no longer worth it for it to continue it. And now we're seeing that replicate out. But it seems like Japan, at least at the time, was sort of the first, whatever, that maybe the tip of that spear that we're dying on or something. I don't know.
Okay, now here's something interesting about when you read about Japanese culture. They have the weirdest sexual crap.
Oh, I was just,
the hikikomori, those young men who just hide in their rooms. You have so many young women. I was reading a piece in the New York Times just somewhere not long ago, where just some massive amount of young Japanese women just don't foresee themselves ever partnering and having children, not because they want it and can't find it, because they just don't want it.
Right.
How does this happen? And the whole sex doll thing in Japan.
Right.
And I think that there's this might be a good segue into our next topic.
Yeah.
How is it, Kale? How is it that we had the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s when sexual desire was radically, quote unquote, liberated, where all the old repressions were cast aside. And here we are now, 50, 60 years later, with massive infertility, with where we're becoming more and more degraded. With you have a young teenage girls who are saying that their male partners try to choke them during sex because they think that that's what women want, because they've watched porn
over and over again since the time they're 12, 11, 10 years old.
So I'm wondering if there's a connection between, or what the connection is. There's clearly a connection. What the connection is between loss of a will to live, to reproduce at the most basic biological level, and the sexual revolution.
Well, no, I know, and I just read your latest post on what was the name of it? Something about Helmut Kentler. So I'm reading this piece about and so the link is just below here for that Rod put up yesterday, but it's about a mid-century German psychologist, right? Who taking his cue from the Frankfurt School, interestingly enough, Eros and Civilization, that the problem, the reason why we had the Nazis, was because of sexual repression. And I got to say, man, this is what we were talking about just before we started. So what in the heck is up with these weirdos in the mid-century? Like, they're crazy. They are this mid-century, let's just throw off all of the rules, so to speak. And we're going to do not only just sort of let people be, but we're going to place children with pedophiles.
That's what Helmut Kentler did. And he did this.
Really, Rod, I mean, again, maybe perhaps people haven't read this, but like that actually happened.
Yeah, and not only did it happen, it didn't happen in secret. Helmut Kentler, as late as the 1980s, gave testimony before German lawmakers about the fact that he was doing this, and this was good for the kids and all that. German society accepted this because, as you mentioned, their theory was, if we don't do this, then we're going to get the Nazis back.
I've been following up on a lot of this, all this woke stuff. I know people hate when I use that phrase, but I don't know what else to call it, right? The critical race theory, whatever, all this sort of stuff, right? And it is amazing how much of it comes out of this mid-century neo-Marxist school, Marcuse and not Gramsci, but him too, but all of these cats, and they had this strange fixation on unbridled eros, as they might call it. It's a very weird. I don't know I don't know how to say it other than that. It's just kind of this weird obsession, with sort of neo-Freudian, neo-Marxian obsession. It's very strange.
They were dirty old men.
Yeah, I mean, really. Men. I mean, I honestly, I think that's what you're kind of left with is that, and they were given kind of carte blanche. If they could dress it up with saying, well, we're going to stop the next generation of Nazis from happening, so we're going to place children with pedophiles so that the pedophiles can raise them. I mean, I even just saying it out loud right now, I can't even believe it, Rob.
Okay, and here's the thing: it wasn't just confined to, weirdo German intellectuals.
Right.
As I put on my blog post, there was a French TV show of the era where Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who was one of the leading of the 1968 generation of student radicals, he later went into green politics. He was talking about on a TV talk show back in the 70s or 70s or maybe early 80s, about how great it felt to have sexual encounters with children.
Oh, good.
I mean, and this was mainstream here in America. I mean, did you ever see that really wonderful film, Almost Famous?
Oh, one of my all-time favorites.
Movies?
Yeah,
all right.
one of my favorites. In fact, it was just on. We were flipping the channels yesterday, and I watched about 20
really
minutes.
Good film. It's set in the early 70s. It's semi-autobiographical about how Cameron Crowe, as a teenager, talked himself into a reporting
Rolling
gig
Stone
with
gig. Yeah,
Rolling Stone magazine. Yeah. But I watched it with one of my older kids last year for the first time in many years.
Yeah.
And it kind of creeped me out, to be honest, because all these groupies are like 16, 17, maybe not even that old.
Yeah.
And this was, I remember reading about this whole era, when the Me Too stuff happened, all these rock musicians of the late 60s, early 70s, they were screwing minor girls.
Yeah, for sure.
And this was considered normal back then.
Or at least it was considered not anything more than a shoulder shrug.
Well, remember Roman Polanski, the famous film director, had to flee this country when he was charged with statutory rape for drugging and raping a 13-year-old girl. Anyway, we could probably go on and on.
Well, I guess. I want to ask you a question about this, though. I mean, what is it about this sort of this mid-century moment where that was just kind of like, oh, that's okay, that's perfectly fine. Older guys in your 20s, 30s, go ahead and get with the late teen girls. I mean, I just don't. Look, I mean, I was born in 73. So like, I remember, the late 70s. I remember the early 80s. I remember the sort of, I'm groping at memories, right? They're all a little bit hazy.
Don't use that word. Don't use the groping word in this context.
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
please.
Apologies. I'm grasping. I'm searching for the sense of it. But, I mean, think of a movie, another Cameron Crowe movie. It's a perfect example, actually. And maybe there's a whole through line with Cameron Crowe movies now that I think about it. Fast Times at Ridgemont High. When's the last time you've seen Fast Times at Ridgemont High?
I hate to say I've never seen it.
Okay. In the context of this, what we're talking about here, you got to watch it. And like, it's almost like the entire teen movie oeuvre of the 80s was about how to get girls, how to have sex with young girls. I mean, it's really weird, right? And so like, there's all about this, and whatever. It's clearly sort of like these sort of older male fantasies of younger girls, and it's just remarkable to me that this was just mainstream.
Okay, well,
now we live in a sort of a world now, which is interesting in 2021, where we have a kind of, I think, a properly resetting our boundaries about childhood sexuality in one vein, yet in another vein, you can just, elect to, lop things off because you feel trapped in the wrong biological body.
I know. And this is one of the points I was trying to make in my blog post that, we have gotten better. We realized, oh my God, we lost our damn minds as a culture with this pederasty in the 70s and 80s. And we began to turn that around. That's all to the good. It shows that we can turn things around. On the other hand, as you mentioned, we're now doing things where giving little children hormones and cutting off the breast of a healthy breast of 13, 14-year-old girls, et cetera. And I think, and nobody's questioning that. Just like Dr. Kentler, Helmut Kentler, the German psychotherapist, was respected as the foremost expert of all this and deferred to by the media in Germany, by German lawmakers in the same way. Well, trust the science. We trusting all these creeps who are about stealing the gender identity of our children and screwing with their minds. And I really do think that, I don't know, give it another 15 years or so, and we're going to look back on this period in the way that we look back on Dr. Kentler today. But think about all the damage that will have been done.
Well, I'm going to cart this out and understand that I'm using it kind of as a metaphor. So let me see what you think of this. How is this not just another version of child sacrifice? Like, think back, like you read in scripture, when the Israelites are coming up, running up against different tribes in Canaan, and they're coming up against tribes, Moloch and Mammon and all of these tribes that worship these altar gods, and the one thing that was different about the Israelites, right, is that their God refused and was abhorred child sacrifice. But it's one thing to sort of bring a child up to the altar and kill them on the altar and that sort of thing. That's sort of the most obvious version of it. Yeah, right. Who hasn't, right? No, but like that's a clear. You could kind of clearly understand that. But how have we not been living through a kind of neo-Malachian period here since the Second World War?
Well, that's an interesting way to frame it, Kale, because you make me think that what would this Helmut Kentler period of the 60s and 70s have in common with our own period now, with the child transgenders and all that? One thing they have in common is Christianity would have opposed both of them. And if people in Germany and in the United States had adhered to what we are taught in the Bible, Orthodox Judaism, Christianity, this wouldn't be happening, and this would not have happened. It was only when we got progressive and grew past all that and sought liberation that we began to sacrifice our children in this way.
Yeah, right. So like you think about, in the 70s and 80s, we would sacrifice our children to, pederasty, clearly pedophilia, and all versions of that. Now we, since that has sort of, we have seemed to, as a culture, lost our taste for that, quote unquote. Now we're moving into a different version of child sacrifice, right, in which, we are in our current madness, right? But all of it has as its end an extinction of the future, right? If children are incarnate hope for future, right? So that, you and I have children. I mean, one of the things that I didn't understand until I had my own children was how much I want to see my own children have children. I really do, and I pray for that often, and and it worries me. My children are wonderful, but what kind of world are they going to be in? Are my children going to find appropriate mates to marry and have their own children? Et cetera. But children are hope incarnate, and so if you are destroying this incarnation of the future, what does that say then about us? I think about, taking it back to Japan, right? And this demographic cliff that they're about to go off of. Not surprised, of course, that you have all of these voluntary and involuntary celibates, that it's a landscape replete with pornography. And people are just saying, it's not worth it to have children. We are saying that it's not worth it for our children, to protect our children so that they don't do something when they're 14 years old that will preclude them from having their own children moving down in the future. And, I want to give a shout out to a podcaster. His name is Benjamin Boyce, and he's been doing this fascinating series, really just talking with people who have detransitioned, right? That they were sort of caught up in the whole trans movement and they have detransitioned, and just talking with them in these long form podcasts. I tell you, it is really moving stuff. I'll put a link in the bottom of the show here that you can link to his stuff. But it's heartbreaking because as Abigail Schreier points out in her own book, that these are changes that are irrevocable. Even if you decide, to do this when you're 14 and you elect when you're 21, let's say, or 25, that you no longer want to do this, you want to quote unquote go back. There's no real going back from that. And, how can you expect a 14-year-old child to make a decision that will preclude them from being able to bear their own children when they're 30? That's just why are people not more mad about this, Rod?
Yeah, and why?
And I'm mad for them. I'm not, I'm not throwing darts at people here. I'm mad for them.
I mean, these young people are victims of an adult culture that doesn't care enough to stop them from this. I mean, if they want to do this when they're adults, I would still be against it, but that's one thing. But it should not be legal to do this to children. And you don't even, look, here's the weird thing about it. Even in our home state of Louisiana, one of the most conservative ones in the country, the state legislature passed a law recently protecting women's sports, high school sports, right, from trans athletes. The Democratic governor vetoed it. His veto was sustained.
That's amazing to me.
And it was sustained because it was barely sustained, but it was sustained. And it was all about losing business. They were so afraid that if it passed, that Louisiana would lose convention business and all that.
Wait, how does that work? Explain to the audience how that would work. I don't understand.
Yeah, because the NCAA, they're afraid the NCAA will say that if you ban trans athletes, then we will not bring tournaments there to your state, and that some conventions might not come to.
So a place like New Orleans, that's huge. I mean, the state, my gosh, how much of our GDP comes just from the fact that people come to New Orleans for conventions or tournaments or all that kind of thing? I can see, okay, I see how this works.
You see where it comes from now. But it tells you something, though, about the kind of civilization we've become, where, and this is just about athletes, but you've already let the camel's nose under the tent. In the end, preserving our wealth, we're willing to sacrifice our children to preserving our wealth and our sense of our middle class sense of comfort. It's not, I don't think it's too much, Kale, using your analogy to say that we're definitely sacrificing our female athletes.
Sure.
But, and we're ultimately going to end up sacrificing our children. And we don't want to think about it that way.
And what's frustrating to me about the female athlete thing is that, look, I have seen what I've seen real good come from competing athletically at high levels, and especially amongst girls and young women. It's remarkable that those women who have had success in athletics and even college athletics go on to succeed in life professionally, for what it's worth, at such a high rate, that you can really understand that the kind of habits that you lean on and learn from and inculcate as an athlete clearly translate to, your life. Right? The idea of self-discipline and putting yourself through all these sort of things. And so to see that potentially get sacrificed as well that's a tough pill to swallow. It's just, I don't know, it's just kind of disgusting, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
I mean,
I got to tell you this too, and this is one thing that really disturbs me. There's a commenter on my blog who about half or maybe more than half of his comments I spike. Some of them are really interesting, but he's gotten to the point where whenever we talk about stuff like this, he says openly, your choice is this or fascism. And he's a fascist. He's an actual fascist.
Okay. Okay. I'm sorry. I was misunderstanding where. Okay. So
your choice is to continue to accept this further degradation and decadence or fascism. He said, where do you think the Nazis came from? And I don't allow this stuff onto the blog because I don't want to get a reputation as being a blog where people who are actual open fascists have a voice.
Right.
That said, I think the guy's probably onto something in this way. And please, listeners, hear me. I'm not saying that he's right, but I'm saying that at some point this has to stop. And I think there will be a massive backlash, and that backlash could take the form of right-wing violent political radicalism. We should at least bear this in mind, that the 20th century Germany is a really good example of how a society that is flying apart with licentiousness and economic insecurity can turn to violent right-wing authoritarianism in an attempt to right the ship.
Well, and I think it's an important historical note because I do think that there are analogies for our current moment. We look back to the Third Reich as if it were a fait accompli, right? That Germany was always already going to be a fascist state. But if you even just take a little bit of an adult dive into the history, you'll see that it was a coin flip. Right, it was a coin flip in Germany, in Weimar Germany, between on the one side the right wing National Socialists, and on the other side the left wing Communists. In the middle were these sort of feckless Republicans, who believed in democracy, basically understood, and it's not that Hitler rode the fascist wave. He and his group created the fascist wave as a more compelling option against Bolshevism or communism, and and so both are forms of authoritarianism that promise structure. They promise solidity. They promise stability. They promise reckoning. It's the same language, Rod, that we see being thrown around in our space right now between the very loud voices on the left right now, and I'm concerned, as are you, especially both of us are conservatives. I'm concerned, when will the loud voice of the right when will they find their voice? Because I'm concerned about that too. And it's not QAnon. It's not the LARPers from January 6th, although, it could be there too. But I'm just worried that is going to manifest itself. And once that becomes unleashed, I don't know where is the terra firma, in all of that.
Good. That is going to be one of the most important political questions, I think, of the next 10, 15 years.
So you had mentioned to me that, you think that there are some things that the American right, mainstream right, I suppose we would say, can learn from the European right, as you sort of have spent the summer there. You want to unpack a little bit of that, what you were thinking about?
Yeah. I just have some tentative thoughts, but we've been talking about that recently. I had Steve Hayward was over here recently. Yeah, he's Reagan conservative from California, really nice guy, and his presence here occasioned some conversation among some of us Anglo-American types about what a shame it is that we don't tend to look past the English Channel when we conservatives when we're thinking about the right, and our media just gives such a false impression of the European right. They, as far as the media are concerned, it's nothing but jackboots past the channel. Which is just so wrong. I mean, I've gone on and on as we've done these podcasts this summer about how wrong, just flat out wrong and slanderous the image of Hungary is. And by the way, a side note, Tucker Carlson is coming here in a few days to do some shows from Hungary and do a documentary about it. I couldn't be happier, simply because this will be the first time the American people will have gotten to the American media a different, and I believe more accurate picture of this country.
Right.
All right. Nevertheless, I think when I look at the healthy movements of the right here, not the Christian Democrats who are just basically, liberals, right-wing liberals, but people like the Fidesz party here in Hungary, Law and Justice in Poland, the Vox party in Spain, and others. I mean, there's differences there, certainly. I think of Marianne Maréchal in France. What I see they have in common is they are much more market skeptical than the Anglo-American right is. They have a more holistic view of society and the connection between state and society and other institutions of society. I think, Kale, that this comes out of Catholicism, frankly.
Interesting.
Whether they're Catholic or not anymore, most countries over here.
The latent spirits of all these things that we work through us. Right.
Yeah, I think I hate the word holistic. It sounds so new agey, but it really is true. If you go back and look at the speech that Marianne Maréchal, the young French Catholic intellectual and party leader.
We'll put the link at the bottom of the show.
She gave a speech at CPAC a few years ago. And I thought it was absolute dynamite. As a Christian conservative who is more continentally oriented in my thinking, but I can imagine most people there had no idea what she was talking about. And again, it goes back to the market. I think I found myself trying to explain to people just today in lunch with my this archaeologist. He was asking about American politics. And I said, we find ourselves in the American right in a really radical period of transition, and the left does too, because the big business, which had heretofore been thought of as stalwarts of the right, they have become very much on the left, become very woke, and the left has made its peace with big business. So you're seeing now that on the right, this dawning awareness that the only institution powerful enough to protect us and our businesses from the power of big business and these other institutions is the state. The European right has something to say about that sort of thing. Because
in American conservatives are just so unaccustomed to thinking in those terms, right? I mean, I think that's part of the Reagan zombie, the zombie Reaganism that we've talked about before, right? But I mean, look, one of Reagan's great quips of his successful presidential run was, what are the most scary, what are the scariest words that you can hear? Knock knock. I'm from the government. You know the quip I'm talking about?
I'm from the government. I'm here to help.
I'm here to help, right? And and look, I get that. Like, there's part of that kind of like inner libertarian part of me that's like, yeah, freedom, rah, and you're like, yeah, I don't want that help. But I recognize now, in my age, that all of these are sort of forces and powers and principalities that need to be offset by one another, and so especially with the rise of woke capital, you look at the instance as you reference in Louisiana, where the John Bell Edwards, the Democratic governor, vetoes the bill that would have banned biological boys from competing against biological females. And what he's concerned about, as we've just said, he's concerned about the loss of revenue that is generated because the NCAA would shut down, tournaments and conventions, et cetera. And so I think that gives the lie to Americans right there. And I think we're all implicated in this. And at the end of the day, we want our cake and we want to eat it too. We want our yum-yums, right? We want the good stuff, because let's just say that Edwards would have been bold enough to say, you know what? I'm going to sign that bill and let the revenue be damned. I mean, what would have happened to him, Rod?
I don't know. I mean, he would have been, I think most people in Louisiana would have been grateful for it. I mean, this is a governor who signed the heartbeat bill, but of course he is facing re-election, but he's a pro-life Democrat. But I think most people in Louisiana would have supported him. But
But what about 2 years down the road when New Orleans is depressed and revenue is depressed? I mean, that's where I think it exposes the kind of the inner hypocrisies of the electorate.
Yeah. Which, believe it or not, Kale, I'm looking at the clock too. Yep. And that brings us to our last topic, which is what The Pillar did. This independent Catholic news site did in exposing the Monsignor Jeffrey Burrell. They found evidence by mining his data, his cell phone data. They found evidence indicating that he was an avid user of Grindr, a gay hookup app. Right. They brought this information to Monsignor Burrell, asking him to confirm or deny. He never answered them. They brought it to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. They kind of hemmed and hawed. Right. And when Ed Condon and J.D. Flynn, the two principals there at The Pillar, were on their way to a meeting at the USCCB about it, they got word that Burrell had resigned. Right. But the reason I brought this up, Kale, in response to we all want our yum-yums, we want to have our cake and eat it too. Right. When they published this information about Burrell, a heck of a lot of Catholics got mad at The Pillar. Yeah, you expect liberal Catholics to do this. I mean, they thought it was unfair. They're witch hunting target.
Father James Martin was right away out on Twitter and decrying the witch hunt to a vulnerable priest, for instance. Right.
Yeah,
but that's
I can't
imagine, right?
I can't imagine why Jesuits would be worried about people going through data looking for evidence of using gay hookup apps. Anyway. But what surprised me was a number of conservative Catholics complained about this too. They thought it was going too far. Now, I defended Flynn and Condon vigorously because even though I'm not a Catholic, I know what they're going through. They, in my own years writing about the abuse scandal as a Catholic, right. One of the things I learned is, I got lots of phone calls from people who knew tips from priests and lay people who work for the church saying, this is the dirty thing going on. You've got to do something about it. Well, sir, are you willing to go on the record or give me a document? Oh, no, I couldn't possibly. It's too dangerous. Right. And I mean, this happened all the time. Well, guess what? Flynn and Condon acquired this data legally on the open market and used it to nail this guy who was not just, Father Joe at the parish down the block, but the top official, the most powerful non-bishop Catholic official in this country, a guy in charge of setting policy for sexual misconduct among priests. Right. But a lot of conservative Catholics got mad at him because it didn't seem sporting, chap. And I'm thinking, you people want reform. You say you want reform. Yeah. Well, this is what reform looks like. There was one prominent Catholic integralist online on Twitter today saying that, that this is outrageous. The Pillar should have let the church handle this. The church has competence to investigate this. And I'm like, wait, you're kidding me. After the last 20 years, who in their right mind believes the Catholic Church institution can be trusted to investigate itself and police itself for clerical sexual misconduct?
I mean, look, I'm restraining myself right now because, like,
don't do it.
The rage that is bubbling up right now when I hear this kind of strange new respect for proceduralism. Which is what I thought people used to make fun of the David Frenches of the world. Oh, you only care about, you only care about procedure, where that's going to get you. Well, no, look, I mean, how give me one shred of evidence that the institutional church has been competent to handle itself in the last decades. I mean, just give me one. I mean, certainly people in our audience, certainly the Catholics in the audience, I'm sure have read the risible McCarrick report, which laid all the blame on John Paul II. It was clear, I don't even know where to go. I mean, it's
no. John Paul knew, but everybody knew.
No. I know that, but I'm talking about the specifically. We were
Yeah.
told that there would be an investigation about McCarrick and who knew and when they knew and all this sort of stuff. And all we get is this ridiculous document that lays the bill at all these dead people.
How do you say
Ridiculous.
ass covering in church Latin?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. I should learn it so that I can cart it out from time to time. But look,
okay,
I'm shocked.
Okay, here's the thing, though. From what I can see online, J.D. Flynn and Ed Condon, who are conservative Catholics who are not ideological. I mean, they're conservative theologically, but they're not ideologues. They from all appearances, they really love the church.
Yeah.
But now they've suddenly become a pariah within the church that they love because they saw serious wrongdoing and set out to fix it.
They're catching heat from certain Catholics, right? And which is interesting to me is that you would think that a certain group of Catholic. I mean, I have a whole slew of folks on that I would consider sort of conservative-ish or traditionalist-ish Catholics who are cheering on the work of the Pillar. Specifically in this instance.
I hope they'll raise their voices publicly and put
they
their
need
names to it.
I'll add my voice to that because, there will be no moving forward in any healthy kind of way until the church cleans itself up, right? Until you press out all the pus of this damn boil, right? It's going to continue to erode confidence and destroy the witness to faith. And that you would get all worked up. I'm calling this like a gay sex witch hunt. Like, no, it's not. But, calling it, somehow, it did just dismissing Ed and JD, as if they aren't careful people, that they're, it's really unfortunate. I'm sorry I'm not as articulate as I hope to be.
I can tell you're really passionate about this,
but
let me point this out. We were talking earlier in our discussion about people being willing to sacrifice their children. One of the things that really got to me 20 years ago when I was investigating this stuff, almost 20 years ago, is how many Catholic normies in the pews didn't want to know this. They just didn't want to know it. They weren't upset about it. I mean, because I think in theory they were upset about it, but deep down, it was more important to them to preserve their sense of everything's fine, everything's calm. And I wanted to say, don't you realize they're not going after Protestant children or non-Christian children. Right. They're going after Catholic kids. Yeah. This is your church, but I could see what was working here psychologically. The idea that it was more important to them to believe that everything was okay than it was to actually fix the problem in front of them. And this is not a Catholic problem specifically. This is a problem of human psychology. I mean,
I read a piece the other day, and I'm sorry for not remembering it off the top of my head. I will look it up and include it in the show notes. But it was a riff on the idea of the perfect family photo. And the perfect family photo, which everybody's lined up and they've got the right outfits on and they're at the beach, baby, and everybody takes the picture and you have this perfect little picture. But meanwhile, what it took to get that perfect picture out to everybody is people yelling at each other, screaming at each other. There's all this sort of stuff going on the under, but people really like the idea of the image of a healthy church. Well, guess what? The image of a healthy church is meaningless unless it's real. Yeah. And to me, the work that Ed and JD have done through the Pillar in exposing this grinder business is that, this is the kind of stuff that needs to be, out in the open, bright lights shining on this, because none of us, no Christian, right, is allowed to live a double life. I understand there's an idea of having a private life and a public life. I do understand, but that's not what we're talking about here. This is a double life. This is saying you're one thing publicly, but in reality being another thing. And look, as I said last episode, Rod, we're sinners. We all miss the mark, okay? But you can't project this image that you're in charge of helping the church clean up its act. Meanwhile, you're hopping on Grindr every chance you get. You just can't, that's not allowable. Right, imagine what Ted McCarrick would have been capable of doing with Grindr.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Well, I said on my, I said on my blog, I said, what if J.D. Flynn and Ed Condon had found evidence using publicly available, commercially available data that the head of the USCCB was attending white supremacist meetings?
Right.
You know,
Right.
Ed and JD would be hailed as heroes today.
Right. That's right.
You know, but
That's
guess what? You know,
but it hits the sacred cow, right? And I think the theme of this show has really been this sort of, we are living through, I hope, the death rattles of the sexual revolution. I mean, this is just this is the fruit, right? This is the rotten, poisonous fruit of this game we decided to play in the mid-century, in which we would just pretend that sexual rules don't matter anymore. I'm just going to do whatever and hope it all turns out right. Liberation is good, right?
And I got to think, you were talking about kids, Kale, and I got to think that kids who see men in the institution of churches, who are supposed to be holy, living hypocritical lives, even as they expect, and say they expect everybody else to be holy, that discredits the institution. Yeah. And it's one thing when that happens, when there's really nowhere else to go, when the whole society is affirmatively Christian. Mm-hmm. You might be held into the faith by the guardrails that are everywhere.
Right.
But guess what? The guardrails are down.
The guardrails
They're down
gone.
now.
Yeah, the guardrails are gone. Yeah.
In Poland today, the Polish church has been going through this agony of more and more revelation of sex abuse, of bishops covering it up, and so on and so forth. The membership in the Polish church is starting to decline, especially among the young generation. I mentioned in this podcast before about how young Catholics there in their 20s tell me that they expect their country to go the way of Ireland in the next decade.
Which is like a blink and it's over.
Yeah.
Blink, done.
I hope that's wrong. I hope and pray that that's wrong. But if it does happen, there's more to it than just the church's church bad apples. That said, neither the Catholic Church nor any religious institution in 2021 in this post-Christian society has any room for mistakes. I mean, mistakes will be made. Right. We're all human. We're going to fall. But if we don't all of us Christians don't clean up our act and demand integrity of our religious leaders and of ourselves, frankly, then we're going to lose the next generation.
Right. And look, let us not forget, kids are good, like capital G good, be fruitful and multiply, and be darn sure that you protect the multiplied. Right. This is basic. This is like right out of Genesis, right? This is not a hard one, people. Be fruitful and multiply, have children, and protect those children, and inspire in them God's love so that they want to do the same thing. Like, that's what we're here for. Now, we've said this over and over and over again. We have forgotten what we're for. We're not for our 401k plan. We're not for our retirement. We're not for our beach house. We're not for the convention that comes to New Orleans, et cetera. Like, we're for something much more profound, right? We're made for God, right? To know, love, and serve God now and be with him forever in the next. And so if we're not protecting the most precious thing that God gives us, which is children, then blow it all up. Right. I mean, then the whole thing's a stupid shell game, and get what's yours. And I think that's the subtweet of the sexual revolution. Get yours because life is meaningless. Right. But we as Christians, of course, stand in witness in opposition to that. Right. We say to, that no, life is good. People are good. Loving the Lord is good, and that's what we're for. And yet we see all of these things, from these stories that we've run through today. It comes from that basic misapprehension of what our telos is, and we need to remember that. And I think that's why that's why you and I are Christians.
Yeah. All right. Well, my friend, we've had a lot of maximum heaviosity today.
That's kind of what we do, Rod. I think it's our brand. I think it's our brand.
So I'm gonna head back to my flat. This is my last week in Budapest.
Ah, yes.
And I'll be doing some traveling through Austria and down to Italy next month, and going on a book tour of Italy in early September, a short one, and then back to the great state of Louisiana on Labor Day weekend.
Oh man, that's nice. That's good. Well, all right. Well, look, folks, if you could do Rod and I a favor, and Rod and me a favor, I guess. Yeah, Rod and me a favor. Please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. If you feel as inclined, you can rate us on iTunes or whatever, wherever it is you listen to this. When you get it, we'd appreciate it. And on that note, Rod, why don't you send us out?
Don't get nothing on you.
Take care.